I'm honored to be able to introduce His Eminence George Cardinal Pell, who is the Cardinal Priest of Santa Maria Domenica, Mazzarello. That's the title of his cardinal church. And we all know how much Cardinal Pell has suffered in the last year or so. We look forward to the interview, which we will now listen to. And his interviewer is Marilyn Rodriguez, a journalist for the Catholic Weekly.
Well, Your Eminence, good morning.
Good morning, Monica.
So is there any special message you'd like to send out to your friends at Napa, Eminence?
Well, I'd firstly like to thank them for the invitation. I very much admire the work that is being done by Napa. It is high quality, it's gospel-based, it's Christocentric. It's a wonderful contribution, so I commend what you're doing and thank you for it.
So we're here obviously to talk about your experience, particularly over the last couple of years. Can you give us some thoughts about your time in prison? What surprised you? What gave you hope?
Well, it was 13 months. It was a different time, which goes without saying. I'd visited prisons as a priest and a bishop. I'd mixed widely, and I had a very limited interaction with the other prisoners, so there were no great surprises there. I was surprised by the decency of the overwhelming majority of the prison officers, the warders. They would talk, converse, were quite human, decent, and not just with me, but I could hear the way they were dealing with the other fellows in solitary, and some of them were totally unreasonable, frightfully damaged by drugs. Now, I mean, the original sin exists amongst the warders too, but nonetheless, I was pleasantly surprised by their professionalism and decency. And the chaplain confirmed this too. I felt the prison was pretty well run.
What gave you hope inside the prison?
Well, the virtue of Christian hope, of course, is different from human optimism. Christian hope tells you that no matter what your circumstances are in this life, eventually all will be well. That a good God is in charge, even though terrible things happen, natural disasters, big explosions, as for example recently in Beirut. These things happen from the permissive will of God. Now that's different from human optimism. And I knew intellectually, forensically, my case was enormously strong. Many good lawyers said it should never have been brought to court. But after a succession of knockbacks, while I knew intellectually my case was still strong, I wasn't particularly optimistic in a human sense at all. I wasn't quite sure, especially after my appeal was knocked back, I wasn't quite sure what way the things would go. That was, I suppose, a psychological defence.
Being in prison, you were obviously not able to celebrate Mass for more than a year. How did your prayer life change?
Well, it changed radically simply from that fact, because I celebrate Mass daily. And also I had a habit of when people would ask me to pray for them on some significant issue, I would offer Mass for them, where obviously I wouldn't be able to do that. And I had many people writing to me for prayers when I was in jail. So I would say a memorare for their intention immediately, so that something would be done. In jail, you've got no excuse that you're too busy to pray. So I had a regular prayer routine, and of the breviary, meditation, and I followed that spiritual reading generally. I followed that every day, and then on Sunday I watched Mass View at home at the impossible hour of 6 o'clock in the morning. And then I watched the American evangelists, Joseph Prince from California and Joel Osteen from Texas. And I would, in my journal, I'd make a theological critique of their efforts. But both of them are very fine preachers, and they got big following.
So, Your Eminence, you mentioned that you had a lot of people asking you for prayers. How did you keep in contact with people on the outside?
Well, it was mainly one-sided. I received, until I left, around about 4,000 letters, as I keep explaining to people. I didn't count them because I knew the trouble King David got into when he had a census of his people. God disapproved. So I didn't, the only letters, nearly all of which I replied to, were fellow prisoners. Although my legal team counseled me not to do that, I thought as a priest I probably should. So with one or two exceptions, I replied to all those prisoners. Otherwise, I rarely replied. With some I did, a particularly poignant letter here or there. Some people from a couple of women from Texas wrote very, very regularly to me, and very stimulating and beautiful, interesting letters. Gave me something to chew on theologically and spiritually. So, and I kept in contact with the world through the television. I had the Herald Sun, which is a daily, not a broadsheet, not a highly sophisticated paper, but a pretty good newspaper. We were only allowed that 3 times a week in the assessment prison. Had to be ordered again every time. You couldn't put in a permanent order. That's one of the typical little humiliation of the prisons. And SBS is an ethnic television station here for the multicultural Australia. It's got good international news, so I would watch that most nights. So I was pretty well abreast of things, and of course people would send me cuttings. Friends sent me loads of articles. They realised that useful to have a bit of intellectual stimulation while I was there. So I kept myself occupied, and of course I wrote my journal. I thought I'd be in for 3 or so months. So I wrote 3 pages a day, which would have given me, I roughly estimated, a book of 250 pages, because I was there 13 months. So, and I considered not continuing to write, but I'm glad I did. It was good therapy, and you know, I might have something to say that can help people.
You mentioned hearing from women from Texas. We're obviously streaming to an American conference at the moment. Any other American friends you heard from during your time?
Oh, many. I mean, perhaps my strongest supporter and closest friend in America is George Weigel. So he was a regular. I thought his articles, as always, were first rate, even when he was defending me. Um, Raymond de Souza, of course, is another fine writer from Canada, Father Raymond de Souza. But the cardinals, Cardinal Dolan wrote a number of times. Cardinal Mahoney, I'd been on the Vatican Finance Council before the Vatican Secretariat, where we had both battled ineffectually for years to improve the situation. Cardinal O'Brien from Rome, Cardinal Burke, Bishop Jim Conley. I received a lot of letters too from American priests, Monsignor Jim Maroney. So I received, and many lay people from the States. I received a lot of help, a lot of help and a lot of support, for which I'm very, very grateful.
So, from the vantage point of prison and seeing the outside world, I guess, through the news and through the letters you were receiving from others, what was your perspective on the year that was while you were in prison?
Well, of course, it's now been dominated by the coronavirus. It began slowly enough. I didn't really anticipate it would spread to these pandemic proportions. Another area which very much interested me was Brexit. I was a strong supporter of Brexit. I felt if it had been Catholic Europe and not anti-Christian Europe, my reaction might have been slightly better. But I mean, the English have had self-rule for 1,000 years, and I was the Japanese ambassador to the Vatican was lamenting the Brexit result to me, and I said, perhaps a little unhelpfully but directly, I said, well, Japan wouldn't like to be ruled from China, and he conceded that immediately. Another area which was of concern to me was the Amazon Synod. I wasn't quite sure how that was going to turn out, and in the end it wasn't, the results weren't too bad. I felt that some of the people who were given leadership in the preparation of the Synod, one bishop who'd never converted a local resident in all these decades as a missionary, I found one or two of those things quite remarkable, but the end result was that as far as I could see there wasn't too much damage done. What gains there were, well, it would be for those who were present to say. But I, as always, I've kept a lively interest in what's going on in the world around me. In Australia, we had terrible bushfires, then we had floods. So we had the cricket, the Test cricket, so which I follow closely. So I kept abreast of the world.
One of the things you must have been keeping abreast of while you were over there were the news coming out about the Vatican finances. What are your hopes for the finances in the Vatican?
Well, you see, the Vatican is losing money every year. Was deteriorating even before the coronavirus. I think in the last 2 years before the coronavirus pandemic, my successor said they lost 50 million a year. With the arrival of the virus, that's got consequences for rents, investments, but especially it has consequences for the Vatican Museum. I mean, I can't remember the exact sums, but they'd bring in 50 or 60 million euros a year. I might, but it's a money of that order. Now that's almost completely gone. Now it's a little bit graphic to say that the Vatican's going broke, because it isn't. It does have not a big patrimony, it'd be less than some of the great American universities, considerably less as a patrimony. But you can't keep losing money at the rate they are at the moment forever. So that it's a very fundamental reality. It's public knowledge. I'm not letting anybody into any state secrets. Nor is it a state secret that they have a very, very looming and very considerable deficit in the pension fund. Now, nearly every other country in Europe has that too, but that's not much consolation. Now, I'm well out of it. I'm 2 or 3 years behind what people are thinking, but at least in a published sense, I haven't seen any suggestions that would really address what is a significant financial challenge, if not a radical one. I'm sure the Vatican can rely ultimately on the generosity and mutual support of people around the world, but if you've got 300 properties and you only generate an income of less than 100,000, there's something wrong with your system. And undoubtedly too, it's been bedeviled over the years by inefficiency and corruption. London property deals are probably examples of both. Certainly an example of inefficiency at best. And because the church is not a business, it doesn't mean there's any justification for it to be run inefficiently or not to be very strong and vigilant against corruption. So I think the most, if not all, of the crooks are out of the system. You can never be quite sure, but of course you've got to be very vigilant. So I've got every confidence in my successor. They're heading in the right direction, but that promise has got to be brought to fruit. They've just appointed a new finance council. Quite a number of, half them almost, are women, highly qualified women, and I'm optimistic because that they will have a good look at the situation and take a very firm stand on what are the basic issues, and not to be distracted into theorizing or short-term consolations. So I have a qualified optimism.
So back to your time in prison for a minute. What sustained your hope during prison, both personally and your hope for the church?
Well, they're two quite different things. And I think my faith was an enormous benefit, but the particular element in the faith is our belief in redemptive suffering. Now, the humiliation of jail, the quiet, the boredom, that just by itself can be very crippling. But as a Christian, we believe we were saved by Christ's death on the cross, more than any, his life too. It was culminated in his resurrection. But I was quite confident that my small sufferings, and they weren't enormous, were something that could be offered with Christ's suffering for the good of the church. Now, I knew I was innocent. I knew logically and forensically I had a very, very strong case that I would be vindicated. But in a spectacular failure, two of the most senior judges in Victoria were unable to see that. And I got a letter from a long-term prisoner who said, the consensus amongst the career criminals is that you've been stitched up, that of course you're innocent. And he said, isn't it strange that the criminals can see this and the judges can't? And, I understand that. Now, I hope for the church, of course, we're going through strange times, difficult times in the church. In the Western world, there are enormous pressures on the church. Part of the mix in Australia, in my own situation, was anti-Catholicism, and of course the scandal of pedophilia has been used massively by our enemies to further discredit us. There's no getting away from the crimes that were committed. They were infamous, nor were they dealt with well. But in Australia, we broke the back of the offending in the middle 90s. This was even acknowledged by the council assisting in the Royal Commission, who said, the statistic dropped away. So in many dioceses now, I heard of a public meeting where a friend of mine who actually knew what was going on asked the authorities in that diocese, how many offences have you had in the Catholic institutions this century? And there were none, or almost none. And the Catholic audience there was stupefied, had no idea of this. So I think that we made the authorities, the Truth, Justice and Healing Commission, made a significant error in not explaining to people, it might have been unpopular, that in fact the old church from the middle 90s had acted resolutely and effectively to impede this plague, to prevent the offences continuing. So that's just a local example. There's considerable confusion. Many parts of the world, the church is, say in Africa, going ahead, but we're under pressure in many places, especially in the Western world. There is a steady erosion. But if that's the price we have to pay to maintain gospel purity in our teachings, then it's a price we will pay. But the irony of it is, and it's demonstrated in the liberal Protestant world, it's demonstrated in the Catholic world, in Belgium, Holland, Quebec, to some extent Switzerland and Austria. The more you adapt to the world, the faster the Catholic Church goes out of business. Now, we believe Christ was divine, therefore we believe that his teachings have got a unique authority. We have no authority to distort or diminish Christ's teachings. And if we're following Christ, then we're always in a chance that some leader will rise up and help us. Now, I think this has happened already in the last century through Opus Dei, the neo-catechumenal way, just as it did in the 16th century with the Jesuits, in the 13th century the Dominicans and the Franciscans, and earlier with the Benedictines. God is with us, and God's providence is at work, and that's much more likely to work if we're struggling to do what he wants. And we recognise, as a bishop, I have authority to explain and defend the apostolic tradition. I'm not its master. I can't change it at will. And please God, inadvertently I won't damage it.
You mentioned before that your case was strong, you knew you were innocent, but yet you spent 400 days or so in prison.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously a grave injustice, Your Eminence. What kept you from bitterness?
Oh, I think my Christian faith and Christian teaching, and probably a recognition that even from a secular human point of view, bitterness is corrosive and damaging. But not being bitter is a little bit like faith. It's not something you can put in your pocket and it's there forever. You have to continue to pray that your faith will remain strong, and I suppose you have to pray and be vigilant that you don't lapse into a self-centered bitterness and get very hostile or very cross with this or with that. So, but it was my Christian teaching above all that urged me in the right direction on these issues. Look, in conclusion, as someone from Australia who has had a lot to do with the United States, as a great friend and not an uncritical admirer of the United States, but a great friend and ally of the United States, I would just like to remind the audience of just how central and vital the role of the Catholic Church in the United States is, not just for the English-speaking world, but for the whole of the Western world. Now you've had your problems, your scandals of leadership. That is, deeply wounding. I can understand that on top of all of the pedophilia scandals. But overwhelmingly, many parts of the United States are heading in the right direction, like your Californian bishops, the Archbishop of Los Angeles, Bishop in San Francisco, Cardinal Dolan. I think of the great leadership of Cardinal Francis George. Now, it's vitally important for us in the smaller countries. We rely on you for your scholarship, for your leadership, and the pastoral strategies that you implement and that prove to be successful will be watched and imitated by us. So I thank you for the Church in the United States, personified in this case in Napa. I thank you for what you're doing, and in the deepest and best sense of the word, I wish you Godspeed. May God be with you, so that you're wise and prudent and energetic, and in the face of all the hostility that we have, you'll continue to be able to bring Christ to people. And of course, adversity is not necessarily bad for the Church. Adversity can bring the best out of it. So God bless and Godspeed.